Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about distributions of birds in a global context. And in that discussion, I am going to be talking about global patterns, but I'll also be touching on patterns that explain or are thought to explain even local patterns or local observations of species richness. So before I begin that, it's important to think of when we think of species richness or diversity of birds, it's important to realize that we tend to think at a few different scales. One would be the scale of something like a point, say your own backyard, or one point on a breeding bird survey. At any one small point where you might stand, you might be able to observe a certain number of birds. If you were to compile those points across a larger scale of a landscape, say a forest or a large park or something like this, you might expect to actually see some more species because you're crossing space, you're crossing into the territories of different birds, and you might encounter a different species. And then you have these very large scale patterns at the scale of a continent or an ecosystem and then nested within a continent. And all of those can be considered when people are studying patterns of distributions of birds. So when we're thinking about distributions of birds, it's important to understand that across the globe, we see different assemblages of bird species. And these assemblages have to do mostly with the history of those continents. And so birds on two continents might share more bird species than some other two continents, and that might be because they have a more recent history of being connected to one another through changes in continental drift, or maybe there were connections due to climate changes that led to land bridges and this sort of thing. And so when we talk about biogeographic realms, this is from the Handbook of Bird Biology, there are some biogeographic realms where you find alignments of communities, where you find similarities in communities and differences between the communities of not only birds, but also plants and lots of other taxa of living organisms. So this is a map of some of the major realms, the primary realms of biogeography, with the Nearctic, including North America and into Mexico. Well, Mexico is part of North America, but basically North America, the United States, Mexico, Canada, the Neotropical realm, which consists of Central and South America, the Afrotropical realm, which is found on most of the continent of Africa, the Palearctic realm, which is on this large land mass of mostly Europe and Asia, the Indo-Malayan realm, which includes tropical Asia, areas of tropical Asia, the Australian realm, the Oceanian realm, and the Antarctic realm. And so these realms are areas where you find similarities in the community. So for example, with birds, in any ecosystem where you find a substantial number of flowers, you will find birds that become specialized on feeding on nectar. But only in the New World, the Nearctic and the Neotropics, do you actually find hummingbirds. Hummingbirds evolved after those two continents had become separated from the others, and they've not dispersed to other continents. So you only find hummingbirds in those two realms. Now, if you go to Africa or other parts of the world, you will find birds that feed on nectar. In Africa and in the Indo-Malayan realm, you'll find birds that are called sunbirds, and they're nectar-eating birds. They look a lot like hummingbirds, but they're actually passeriform birds, and hummingbirds are actually in a different order. In Australia, there are birds called honey eaters that specialize on eating nectar, and they're different from the sunbirds, and they're different from hummingbirds. And then likewise in parts of Oceania, you'll find honey creepers like you find in Hawaii, and other birds that specialize on nectar. They're not close relatives, but they may look similar due to convergent evolution. And there's lots of examples of this, of birds that are only found in certain realms. Now, because birds are really good at dispersing, there are some birds that are more widespread. The peregrine falcon, for example, is found on almost every continent except Antarctica. And thrushes, birds like robins, are pretty widespread across the globe as well. And there are a lot of other types of groups of birds that are more widespread. And part of that might be their dispersal, part of it might have to do with their evolutionary history. So we have these biogeographic realms, but even within, even when you model the realm into some kind of model of understanding patterns of species richness, beyond that, there are these other sort of overarching patterns that we observe. The strongest pattern that we observe over a large global scale is what we call the latitudinal gradient in species richness. And this gradient is found not only in birds, but plants, insects. Pretty much when we look at almost any taxon, if we look at it closely enough and have good enough sampling, what we find is this pattern that as you move to lower numbers of latitude, as you move toward the equator, you find an increase in species richness and a decrease in species richness moving away from the equator, okay? And this is a map that's showing us patterns of bird diversity. And the warm colors represent high levels of diversity, high numbers of species, and the cool colors represent lower numbers of species. And you can see, here's the equator, kind of bisecting the center of this image. The highest, you get your reddest areas closer to the equator. So this pattern certainly holds in birds, and not only across like continental scales, but at the point scale, at the scale of a person's backyard, or at the scale of a forest, you find more species. For example, in the evergreen forest, you might reliably find 50 species during the breeding season. That would be lucky, between 30 and 50 species. In a similar size forest in the tropics, you could find possibly 200 species. And this is even a more pronounced pattern for, say, tree species, where in an area the size of the Evergreens campus forest, you may not find 2 tree species that are the same. There's so many different ones, and one is very different from the other. So these patterns hold up across a large array of taxa. So people have lots of ideas why we see these patterns. No matter what continent we're looking at, as we move down in latitude, we see this increase. And so a lot of theories have been proposed as to why this is the case. And I'm going to go through some of the theories because they also play into other ideas of how we understand differences in the distributions of species. Here's just an image of the planet again, showing the extent of the tropics. And so you have the equator through the center, and the tropics are found at 23.5 roughly degrees north and south. The northern tropic is the Tropic of Cancer, the southern tropic is the Tropic of Capricorn, and you can see parts of Mexico, Central and South America, Africa, many parts of Asia and parts of Australia, and lots of areas in Oceania are found within this range of latitude. You can also see, for example, the United States is completely out of the tropics, even though South Florida almost gets there. So a little bit about the tropics, why the tropics are like they are. So the tropics tend to be characterized by being warm year-round. So there's not a large amount of fluctuation in daily temperatures in the tropics from one day of the year to the next. Patterns of rainfall also tend to be slightly more stable, although you can have areas that are have dry seasons and wet seasons. And the sun is also very strong within the tropics. And the tropics are actually defined in part by the sun, in part by the orbit of the Earth around the sun. And so here is an image showing the Earth's trip around the sun. Let's start on the right-hand side of this slide with December 21st, the winter solstice. And at this point in time, the Earth, the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun, okay? And the southern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun. So in the southern continents like Australia and South America, it is summertime on December 21st. At that time of year, the sun is almost directly overhead, right at the Tropic of Capricorn. So at the southern tropical boundary, the sun at noontime is directly overhead. Okay, so as the sun makes its trip into spring, what you have is the Earth tilted on its with neither hemisphere closer to the sun. So you have equal days of light and dark. And at that time of year, the sun is directly overhead around the equator, okay? And then as you move into summer, when the North Pole or the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the sun, the Tropic of Cancer, the sun is directly overhead in the middle of the day at the Tropic of Cancer. And then again, moving to the equinox, where neither hemisphere is tilted closer to the sun, and the sun is directly overhead at the equator. So this actually has to do with, it influences the solar energy patterns that you find on the Earth. So even in the hottest part of summer, at the time of year where our days are extremely long, the sun is always found in the south. In the Pacific Northwest, we're 47 degrees in Olympia, north of the equator. And even at the longest day of the year, when the sun is the highest, it's always in the south. It's never directly overhead. We're never getting that full amount of solar radiation hitting the Earth. Okay, so there's less of that energy hitting the Earth because the Earth is tilted in that way. The days are very long here in the summertime, and around the equator, they're always equal in length, equal amounts of day and night. And so what's characterized, what that ends up resulting in is consistently warm weather, very little fluctuation from day to day in day length, in solar energy, in temperature. You may have some fluctuations in precipitation though. And so that stability facilitates the maintenance, what we call the maintenance of diversity. There's no super lean season that's going to restrict populations, okay? Instead, the environments tend to be very stable. And so the bottleneck for organisms in tropical regions is really competition for resources. Okay, so this is from a pretty influential article called On the Generality of the Latitudinal Diversity Gradient. And it sort of reviews some of the hypotheses as to why we find these patterns. And so we understand the Earth's orbit around the sun and sort of this idea of stability in the tropics and consistency of the solar radiation. And it's important when we're thinking of the different kinds of hypotheses that people propose to explain this pattern, that some of them explain patterns at regional scales, some explain patterns at smaller scales, okay? And so if we think of species richness and all these graphs on the y-axis, and then we can look at scale, grain, whether we're looking at a small part of the map or a large part of the map, the range and global richness, we have these different types of hypotheses that might make different predictions, okay? And with latitude, always in all these graphs, we're going from low latitude to high latitude. And so in all these cases, we're seeing declining species richness with latitude. So the different titles on each one of these graphs are some of the different hypotheses that have to do with the scale, the grain, latitudinal ranges, global patterns of richness, dispersal modes, body mass, thermoregulation, trophic level, etc. So I'm going to go through a few of these. Some people say that the latitudinal gradient, a lot of it can be explained by the closest thing we have in ecology to a rule. So we have a hypothesis, which is a very educated guess. It might have a lot of support for it, or it may not. But once there's a lot of support for a hypothesis, you start to move into that hypothesis becoming something that we call a theory. A theory is a hypothesis that's been tested and tested and tested, and there's lots of evidence to support it. A rule is rarely found in ecology, but it's found more commonly in chemistry and physics. These are the closest thing in science that we have to something like a truth. And one of these that we find in ecology is the species area relationship. And that is, as you cover a larger and larger area, the more species you accrue in your observations. At some point, when you reach the level of getting close, to the continent, you start to asymptote because you've reached the maximum capacity or the maximum species pool number. But basically, as you sample more, you get more species. And so this area effect was an important part of the theory of island biogeography. And that's why we're showing island area here and looking at species richness. And so as you, again, this is just reinforcing, as you sample larger areas, you get more species. Now, how fast the species accrue will depend on the species pool, how many species are out there to be observed. Okay, so you might get different slopes to the lines that you create when you go to different continents or different ecosystems to sample. But yet that pattern of as you sample a larger area, you get more species does hold. So if we think of the Earth and we think of the area encompassed by the tropics and the area that's encompassed by these other latitudes, you might say, oh, wow, geez, there is this, the tropics covers the widest part of the planet. And in fact, these are just very rough estimations, but about 40% of the Earth's surface occurs between the limits of the tropics, okay? So that's about 1.7 million square miles. About 44% of the Earth is found in the temperate zone. So this is between 23 to 60 degrees north and south. Okay, so that's encompassing a range of 74 degrees. So the temperate zone, the area that we call the temperate zone, actually covers many more latitudinal bands than the tropics. The tropics only cover 46 latitudinal bands. And so, although more of the Earth is covered in that area that we call the temperate zone, per latitudinal band, there is less area. And then 16% of the Earth's surface is found in what we call the polar regions, the regions that are higher than 60 degrees in latitude, north or south. And so that's actually a pretty small area. So again, thinking about that, you can see that per band of latitude, you're actually covering more area in these tropical regions than you are per band of latitude as you move away from the tropics. And so some people have said, well, that's simply species area effects. That explains a lot about why there are so many more species in the tropics. And so there are other hypotheses, though, that say, hey, maybe species area effects can explain some of that, but maybe not everything. What about this fact that we sort of talked about when we were looking at the Earth's orbit around the sun? What about the fact that there's much more stability in the tropics, that the temperature fluctuations are lower? Doesn't that facilitate the growth of plants and then the survival of insects that feed on the plants and organisms that eat the insects, etc.? And there is a lot of support for that. And so here is a map of variability in the stocks and fluxes of carbon on a global scale. Okay, and so these colors are representing a gradient of net primary productivity, okay, across an annual basis. And even though when we get into latitudes that are far from the equator during the summertime, you can have these very high production rates. So the speed at which an environment can go from snowpack to high productivity is extremely high. But when you average it over a year, you find much higher levels of productivity in the tropics than you do outside of the tropics. So this production of plant material, so net primary productivity is measured by basically the amount of carbon that the amount of carbon that plants uptake minus their respiration, okay? And so you can look at, it basically it's plant growth. So if you measure plant growth over an annual time period, you find that it's higher in tropical regions. So I'm going to show you a cool simulation of changes in productivity, net primary productivity across the globe, across annual cycles. So I'm going to go to this link. I think I have to stop my share here and then share this link. Okay. And this is from NASA Earth Observatory, and this is a map that's showing us patterns, fluxes of net primary productivity across annual cycles. And it's starting in February 2000. So I want you to sort of be toggling back and forth between the timeline and also the map. So we're starting in February. February is Northern Hemisphere winter. And so if you look at this scale, we're going from negative productivity all the way up to high productivity, okay, about up to 6.5 gigatons or something like this. I can't remember my my units for carbon per meter squared per day, so very high rates of productivity. And so you're looking for these fluxes in green. And right now in February, you're seeing lots of productivity in the southern hemisphere and in the tropics. So I'm going to play this simulation. Okay, moving into summer, back into summer, and then back into winter, back into summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter. And so you can watch these fluxes, and it's taking us all the way up to 2016, these changes. Okay. And basically the thing to notice is we do have these big fluxes in the northern hemisphere, but if you keep your eyes on the center of the globe, you'll see that there's always green in that center part. There will be fluxes, and if you look at the sort of the Amazon basin here, there's this flush of green right in the our summertime, and it gets drier in the wintertime, in our winter. But there's always green. There's always fairly high levels of productivity. Here we go. We're continuing to move. And I haven't spent enough time staring at the simulation to have a good idea about how much this is changing from year to year. But this model is supposed to be modeling that. And so there we go. We're almost there to November 2016. So in the latitudes that are far from the equator, there can be huge fluxes in productivity, but then there are also time periods where there is zero or sometimes negative productivity. And those time periods serve as a barrier, a bottleneck for species and for survival of certain species. And so species numbers become limited in those northern latitudes, and they're maintained. We think of it as being maintained in those more equatorial regions, the lower latitudes. Back to my presentation. Okay. This is another simulation. We'll click on it at the end so that you can watch it. There's another view of NASA of Earth from outer space looking at carbon fluxes, and it's very similar. So then there are these historical processes. So at some point in time, I've been mentioning processes that maintain species, that keep them from going extinct or becoming too small in their population size. And the tropics seem to maintain species, and the temperate zones seem to have species blink out because of those bottlenecks in time where there isn't enough resource availability because the productivity is low. And we can think about that also across longer time scales. And so if you look at climate models into the past that reconstruct previous cooling and warming periods, what we find is that these changes in environment that have happened in recent glacial time periods have probably served as what we call cradles, or the tropics have probably served as areas where new species are generated. Because what happens in these tropical regions during cooling periods is the habitats, forest habitats tend to contract, and what you find are fragments and islands of suitable habitat where species become isolated from one another and may, over time, diverge from one another. And then when the climate's warm, the species may come back into contact and be new species. However, those same processes at further north latitudes probably just cause extinction. So if you look here, this is North America during, I think, the last glacial period. And this is the extent of North America that was covered by ice sheet. So when you look at ice sheet, it's safe enough to think for a lot of bird species, forest-dependent species that need, that don't do well in ice and snow, that those would have been time periods of extinction. And so higher extinction rates in the further north latitudes and probably higher speciation rates in the tropics during those time periods. Then there are hypotheses that really focus on the habitat and the environment that the birds or the species are living in. And so you can think of that as the niche. Okay, so a bird's niche is everything it needs to survive. And people often think about that niche in terms of how the bird finds its food. How picky is it about its food? How variable is its diet? And if we think about food, it's sort of easier to wrap your brain around the niche, but the niche also involves finding mates and nesting habitat and this sort of thing. But there have been some niche-oriented hypotheses that think about how more species can be maintained in, say, a similar size tropical forest. And so if we think of this top model here, it's easy. Here we have 3 species. They have different niches. And in fact, there is this concept of what we call limiting similarity, that no 2 species can have the same exact niche and exist in the same exact environment. There will be competition and one species will win out over the other. And so there's some level of tolerance at the edges of the niche, but they have to be different enough to support multiple species. And so there, in the tropics, it's thought, well, perhaps what's going on in the tropics is there are just more resources, more niches out there to be occupied by. And so more species can occupy more niches because there's a larger resource access in the tropics. That's one niche hypothesis. There's been some others, such as niche overlap. So the niches really don't change in size. There's a similar range, but somehow species are able to tolerate more overlap in their niches, in part probably because there are more resources available at all times, so that there can be what they call diffuse competition. There can be some avoidance of competition, and so more overlap is tolerated. Another hypothesis is that maybe niches in the tropics are narrower, so organisms can become highly specialized on resources that you would never be able to become specialized on in temperate environments. And a few examples for birds would be hummingbirds specializing on certain types of flowers. Our temperate zone hummingbirds are mostly migrants, and if you look at their bills, they're not highly specialized on any specific one kind of flower. If they were, there wouldn't be enough resource available for them. And so they tend to be somewhat generalist in their flower preferences. Whereas if you go to the tropics, you can find hummingbirds with bills that are very highly specialized to fit into certain types of flowers. And they can find these flowers across the scale of, say, a tropical rainforest. Those are dispersing, their blooming patterns are, occur across the calendar year because it's a stable environment. The bird can actually be that specialized on those types of flowers. There are species of birds in the tropics that specialize on curled up dead leaves that are suspended in vines and lianas. And those birds specialize by looking in those leaves and finding little insects that are living in there. That is not a resource that birds can exploit on a year-round basis in temperate habitats. And so there are lots of examples like this. And so specialization, frugivores, birds that specialize on eating only fruits, they can do that in the tropics. And so these are some of the niche-based hypotheses. And in truth, probably all of these hypotheses are at play, and it really depends on your frame of reference for understanding diversity. And so it's important to know when I talk about all of these hypotheses that they're not competing with one another, but they're probably working in concert to influence the patterns that we do see globally. A really interesting area of study is mountains, because mountains are really interesting in that you can find patterns in species richness that somewhat replicate much larger scale patterns. So this is a nice little schematic that is showing us latitude. Okay, so going from the equator all the way up to the far northern latitudes, and then altitude in kilometers. Okay, and so if you think about tropical environments and low altitudes, you find similar patterns of species richness as you move up a mountain, and somewhat similar environments as you do when you move up in latitudes. And so people have looked at mountains for a long time as sort of a model system for understanding these larger scale patterns. And if you want to think about that question more, I've provided a link in this presentation to a PhD dissertation defense that happened last year, doing that on the island of Borneo, looking at these patterns of species richness across a variety of mountains. All right.